If you want to build quiet wealth, the first thing you must stop doing is confusing money with noise. Most people have never been taught the difference. They think wealth should look loud while it is being built. It should look exciting. It should look dramatic. It should involve the perfect stock, the heroic startup, the big trade, the raise that changes everything, the windfall. The visible proof that life is accelerating, that is the fantasy. Quiet wealth is something else. Quiet wealth is what happens when your life slowly stops depending on your next emotional decision. It is what happens when you stop treating money as proof and start treating it as structure. It is what happens when your calendar gets lighter, your spending gets cleaner, your investments get more automatic, your ego stops negotiating with your bank account, and your future begins getting funded before your moods have a chance to interrupt. That is a different game, and most people never play it. Not because they cannot, because the culture around them is designed to keep them in the louder one. The culture tells you to upgrade when you earn more, to display improvement when your income rises, to feel behind when other people are performing wealth on your phone, to believe that money's purpose is to make life look better before it makes life freer. That is the trap. The source text you gave me understands this more clearly than most. It says outright that the goal is not simply to get rich, but to break free from the game of always having to make money. And it uses the idea of financial escape velocity to describe the point where assets and investments begin covering life instead of your labor, carrying the whole burden forever. Fay file a site Fay turn 51 file 0 Fay that is exactly the right frame. Money is not most powerful when it lets you consume more. Money is most powerful when it lets you need it differently. That is the line I want you to hold in your mind all the way through this story. Not how do I make more, but how do I build a life that needs my labor less urgently over time? That is the real wealth question. Everything else is secondary. Now let me say something that many people resist because it threatens the story they tell themselves about progress. A bigger life is not always a richer life. Sometimes it is just a louder dependency. A higher salary can still sit inside a fragile structure. A more impressive apartment can still be rented weakness. A better car can still be a prettier chain. A full calendar can still be organized surrender. A person can look more successful every year while moving no closer to freedom. That is the whole problem. The market and the culture both reward visible motion. Neither automatically rewards strategic stillness. But strategic stillness is where quiet wealth is built. Not laziness, not apathy, stillness in the right places, stillness in spending, stillness in ego, stillness in comparison. Stillness in your need to have every gain become visible immediately. The source file turns this into 9 habits. I think that is useful, but underneath those habits sits one deeper logic. Every habit is reducing dependence, reducing noise, or building the kind of automatic structure that slowly gives your life more room and your money more time. Fay Felicite Fay turn 51 file 0 Fay, that is the real story. And if you miss that, the habits can sound too simple. They are not simple. They are foundational. Let me begin where the file begins. Freedom, not things. This may be the most important shift in the entire conversation because until a person changes what money is for, every other habit gets distorted. The source text asks the right question. What is money actually for? Most people answer with bills, upgrades, and visible success. The file then overturns that answer and says money is for freedom, for escape velocity, for reaching the point where the gravity of everyday financial pressure no longer pulls you back into permanent dependence. Fay file site Fay turn 51 file 0 Fay. That is exactly how I think about it. I have never been impressed by money for its own sake. Money is only interesting because of what it can do to the structure of a life. It can reduce coercion. It can buy back your time. It can let you say no to things that weaker balance sheets must accept. It can turn a bad boss from a prison guard into a temporary annoyance. It can make patience economically survivable. It can let you choose rather than merely react. That is freedom. And the public rarely talks about freedom properly because freedom is not always visible. A better watch is visible, a larger house is visible, an expensive vacation is visible, a low monthly burn. A funded emergency reserve, a quietly growing investment account, a life that does not need to perform prosperity constantly, A person who is no longer trapped in every negotiation because he built a cushion years ago. Those things are harder to post. That is why the culture underrates them. But those invisible structures are what wealth actually feels like from the inside. The average person thinks money buys nicer things. Eventually, he may discover that the most valuable thing money buys is less fear, less dependence, less urgency, a little more distance between yourself and the world's demands. That is what the rocket image in the source text is really doing. It is saying that most people never reach the velocity required to stop being dragged back into the same financial gravity, because each time they make more, they add more mass to carry Fe Phyllosite Fe turn 51, file 0 Fe. That is a very useful metaphor. If you use every increase in thrust to strap more furniture onto the rocket, then of course you never escape. That is how most high earners stay trapped. More income, more cost, more pressure, more maintenance, same dependence in a nicer suit. I have seen that pattern in bankers, lawyers, doctors, entrepreneurs, executives, and people whose paychecks would look miraculous to the younger versions of themselves. The outside rises, the inside remains captive. That is what happens when money is directed toward appearance before it is directed toward freedom. So the first habit is not merely a habit, it is a redefinition. Money is not first for looking upgraded, it is for making your life less ownable by other people. Once you understand that, the next habit becomes much clearer. Money is a tool, not a goal. This sounds philosophical until you watch how many people ruin themselves by getting it wrong. The source text says that when money becomes the goal of your life, you lose the plot. You start taking jobs you hate, sacrificing time and health, and confusing the accumulation of more money with the creation of a better life, even though money only solves money problems and tends to amplify who you already are. Fe Phyllosite Fe turn 51 file 0 Fe. That is deeply true. A hammer is useful because it builds something. No one worships the hammer for its own sake. Money should be treated the same way. Money is not the meaning of life. It is an amplifier and an instrument. If you do not know what kind of life you are trying to build, then money becomes dangerously easy to worship because it gives you a scoreboard without requiring you to answer the harder question. What am I actually trying to make possible? That question matters. Without it, people become rich in the most useless way. They gain numbers and lose direction. They gain options and lose the ability to enjoy them. They gain income and lose relationships. They gain status and lose peace. They gain assets and still feel no internal permission to step away because their identity fused to the earning itself. The source text talks about coaching wealthy business owners who no longer know how to separate themselves from their business because money became identity. That is one of the saddest forms of success I know. Fe Phyllosite Fe turn 51 file 0 Fe, because the tool became the master. A person who cannot stop earning, not because he needs the money, but because he no longer knows who he is without the game, is not as free as his net worth suggests. This is why I always say the mature money question is not how much can I make. It is, what am I building with it? A person who cannot answer that cleanly will often make plenty and still remain psychologically poor. He will stay reactive. He will stay hungry in the wrong way. He will use money to patch identity problems that money cannot solve. And once that happens, the whole wealth journey becomes noisier, riskier, and much less joyful. So the second habit is clarity of purpose. Build the life first in your head, then let money serve it, not the other way around. Now let us move to the third habit. Automate your investing before you ever see the money. This is where philosophy becomes engineering. The source file is blunt and wise here. Do not rely on discipline. Build a system, have money move automatically from the paycheck into investments so that wealth grows in the background without monthly debate. Emotional drift, or the promise that next month will be when you finally get serious. Fe Phyllosite Fe turn 51 file 0 Fe. That is one of the best pieces of financial advice in the world precisely because it is so unromantic. Discipline is real. Discipline is also unreliable. You are not the same person every Tuesday. Some weeks you feel sharp. Some weeks you feel deprived. Some weeks you feel rich. Some weeks you feel exhausted enough that your future becomes negotiable. If wealth building depends on each temporary version of you making the right decision manually, then the process is too fragile. You need structure. Out of sight, out of mind is not laziness in this context. It is design. If the money leaves before your appetite meets it, then the appetite cannot make its usual argument. This is why automatic investing is so powerful. It removes performance from the process. There is no monthly moral theater, no self-congratulation for remembering, no self-hatred for forgetting, no debate. The money arrives, the money leaves. The ownership quietly grows. That is how quiet wealth prefers to be built. And because it prefers quiet, most people underestimate it. They think if the action does not feel active enough, it cannot be powerful. That is vanity. A great deal of wealth is built by turning good decisions into invisible infrastructure, not by redeciding them heroically every few weeks. The wealthy person who says, "I always invest first," often sounds more disciplined than he really is. Very often he is just better designed. And design is better than discipline because design still works when discipline gets tired. Now let me tell you the fourth habit: live below your means, especially when you earn more. This is where almost everyone eventually gets tested. The source text explains the pattern perfectly. A raise arrives. Almost immediately the life expands to absorb it: better apartment, better car, more subscriptions, more deserved spending. Then the person remains broke in cash flow terms, only with nicer objects and a more expensive script to maintain. It even gives the startling example of someone making $20 million in net profit in a year and still going bankrupt within 18 months, because lifestyle scale outran structure. Faithful Site Fay Turn 51 File 0 Fay. That story is not unusual in its logic, only in its magnitude. The size changes, the mechanism does not. Wealth is built in the gap. I have said some version of that my whole life. The gap between what comes in and what goes out. That gap is the real engine, not the salary itself, not the business itself, not the title. The gap. If your income rises and your cost of being you rises in exact proportion, then nothing really changed except the maintenance bill. You are wealthier on paper and not freer in reality. That is why raises fool people. They feel like progress even when they do not alter the underlying structure. The mature move is not to never celebrate. It is to refuse to let celebration harden into permanent overhead. The source text suggests holding your lifestyle steady for a couple of years when income rises. I think that is extremely wise because it gives capital time to get ahead of identity. Faithful Site Fay Turn 51 File 0 Fay. Most people do the opposite. Identity outruns capital. Now, the new neighborhood must be maintained, the new car must be serviced, the new image must be funded, the new level of spending becomes the psychological minimum. That is how people with high income remain financially juvenile. Quiet wealth requires the opposite temperament: earn more, yes, but delay the outward translation. Let the raise strengthen the balance sheet before it upgrades the costume. That is how freedom compounds. Now we come to comparison. The fifth habit is to avoid comparison, especially the social media flexing. The source file says this sharply and correctly. Most people are not showing you their net worth, they are showing you their spending. And comparison is the fastest way to feel behind even when you are actually building in the right direction. Fay File Site Fay Turn 51 File 0 Fay. This is one of the great psychological taxes of the modern world. A person can be doing fine saving, investing, getting stronger quietly. Then he opens his phone and within 5 minutes feels late, small, and under-upgraded because some stranger is displaying a car, a trip, a watch, or a house he may not even own cleanly. That is expensive. Not because the image itself drains the account instantly, because the image changes the baseline of enough. The most dangerous financial influence is not bad math. It is bad normal. Social media manufactures bad normal continuously. A better car looks normal, a larger ring looks normal, more expensive dinners look normal, a more photographed life looks normal. And if that becomes your baseline, then quiet wealth starts feeling emotionally unsatisfying, because quiet wealth does not perform loudly while it is being built. This is why comparison is so toxic. It pulls people back into the game the first habit was trying to free them from, the game of looking successful before becoming free. And the source text gets the language right here. You get pulled back into the rat race because somebody else's highlight reel makes your slow compounding feel invisible. Fay File Site Fay Turn 51 File 0 Fay. The cure is not only self-esteem, it is lane discipline. Know what game you are playing. If you are building escape velocity, then somebody else's new lease means very little. If you are building ownership, somebody else's visible spending is often just noise. If you are building freedom, somebody else's performance is not competition. It is theater. The wise person learns to tell the difference. Now let us move to something much more basic and much more brutal. Track your spending. The source file asks the right humiliating question. Do you really know where your money is going? Not vaguely, not sort of every dollar. It then makes the key point that people often think they know until they actually look. And once they look, they discover a trail of unconscious small spending that adds up to a meaningful leak. File site turn 51 file 0 Fe. This is where a lot of people lose respect for themselves and then avoid the mirror. Do not do that. Tracking is not punishment, it is sight. And sight changes behavior. A person can remain undisciplined for years simply because his spending is abstract. Target here, coffee there, eating out, convenience fees, subscriptions, random little comforts. A few things each week, no single act dramatic enough to trigger guilt. Then suddenly the missing money is hundreds a month. The story in the source text about discovering an extra $400 a month going to Target is funny until you realize how common the pattern is. Faithful site turn 51 file 0 Fe people do not usually bankrupt themselves through one grand villainous purchase. They leak. That is the word, and leaks are fixable only after they become visible. This is why I have always believed visibility is one of the most underrated forms of financial power. When you can see clearly, you can choose clearly. When you cannot see, you drift. And drift is how quiet wealth dies before it starts. Now, the seventh habit in the source is to track your net worth consistently. This is more subtle than spending because it moves from monitoring behavior to monitoring direction. The source text says what you track, you improve, and that if you do not know what you own, what you owe, how much you are saving, and whether your accounts are actually growing, then you are guessing. It also emphasizes the psychological shift that happens when the account balance stops being a source of fear and becomes something you can watch grow with increasing steadiness. File site turn 51 file 0 Fe. That is important. A lot of people avoid their numbers because the numbers currently accuse them. I understand that, but neglected numbers do not become kinder. They become less useful. Tracking net worth is not mainly about vanity. It is about direction. A person who never looks at the full board remains emotionally trapped at the level of transactions. He knows this bill, this month, this paycheck. He does not know whether the machine as a whole is strengthening. Net worth gives you the whole machine. It tells you whether the silent work is actually accumulating. It tells you whether the leaks have been reduced enough to matter. It tells you whether the gap between income and spending is becoming an asset base or just a feeling. And once you see that clearly, your relationship with money changes. You stop reacting only to the present tense. You begin living inside a longer arc. That is where quiet wealth becomes emotionally real. Now, the eighth habit is one I care about enormously because I have seen its absence destroy far too many people who seem prosperous. Detach your self-worth from money. The source file is excellent here. It says that many people do not merely want money. They want what they think money means. Status, validation, respect. Proof that they are enough. And once identity fuses to income, every financial movement becomes an emotional referendum on self-worth. File site turn 51 file 0 Fe. That is one of the most dangerous games in the world, because once money becomes identity, rational decision making gets poisoned. You earn more and feel pressured to look like someone who earns more. You lose money and feel less human. You compare and feel smaller. You spend to protect image. You hold on to things you should release because letting them go feels like admitting weakness. This is not financial behavior anymore. It is emotional defense. And emotional defense is expensive. The source file says the same thing another way. Once money stops being a tool and becomes a scoreboard of who you are, it begins controlling your decisions rather than serving your life. File site turn 51 file 0 Fe. That is exactly right. I have known highly successful people who were never truly rich in the emotional sense, because they were still trapped in a relationship with money that required constant proof. More deals, more growth, more visible markers, more performance. The outside looked prosperous. The inside was still enslaved. Quiet wealth demands something harder. It demands enough inner independence that you can let the money work without constantly using it to prove your value. That is a spiritual shift as much as a financial one. Not mystical, practical. Once money stops defining you, it stops controlling you, then you can make calmer decisions. Longer decisions, less theatrical decisions. That is an enormous edge. Finally, the ninth habit, think in decades, not days. The source text closes beautifully here. It uses the seed metaphor. You do not plant a seed and dig it up tomorrow to check whether it is growing. Real wealth is slow, quiet, consistent, and often built over decades, not through fast excitement. Fay Filecite Fayturn 51 file. Zero Fay, that is exactly how I think about it. Most people are trying to solve a long horizon problem with short horizon emotions. That never works. Retirement is not a next quarter problem. Freedom is not a next. Quarter problem compounding is certainly not a next quarter process. If you evaluate a tree by the first month underground, you will call the whole thing a fraud. If you evaluate investing by the first year of boring contributions and modest visible change, you will be tempted to drift back toward excitement. That is why decade thinking matters so much. It protects you from demanding drama from a process that rewards patience. The culture is built against this mindset. The culture wants now, the market news wants now, the phone wants now, the urge to upgrade wants now, the comparison machine wants now. Quiet wealth asks for a different rhythm. Start, fund, hold, repeat. That is all. It sounds too simple. And because it sounds too simple, most people refuse to believe that it could be enough. That is their loss. A person thinking in decades makes very different choices. He does not need each month to flatter him. He does not need each pay raise to become visible immediately. He does not need each market move to justify a response. He does not need life to look upgraded while the foundations are still being poured. That is strength. Now, let me put the 9 habits together. Build your life around freedom. Not things. Treat money as a tool, not a god. Automate investing before your impulses can touch it. Hold your lifestyle steady when income rises. Stop comparing your future to other people's spending. Track every dollar, track the whole machine. Detach identity from income. Think in decades at first glance. These look like separate habits. They are not. They are one system. They remove noise. They reduce drag. They protect the gap. They turn wages into claims. They make the future less dependent on weekly emotions. That is what quiet wealth really is. Not hidden millions, not secret genius. A quieter relationship between your life and your money. A life where fewer things are constantly asking to be fed. A mind less owned by comparison. A balance sheet less distorted by identity. A calendar less colonized by nonsense. An investment process that runs even when you are bored, tired, uncertain, or distracted. That is the architecture. And architecture beats inspiration every time that matters. So here is the final question. When money comes into your life right now, what does it find waiting for it? Does it find a structure that turns it into freedom? Or does it find a louder version of the same consumption machine that has been eating every previous increase? That is the whole test. Not whether you can earn, whether you can keep enough stillness around the earning that it has a chance to become wealth. If the answer is no, that is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of honesty. And honesty is where quiet wealth begins. Because once you stop pretending more income alone will save you, you can start removing the noise, protecting the gap, and building the kind of life that becomes freer, not because it keeps proving itself, but because it quietly stops needing to. That is how real wealth is built, not in public, in structure. And structure, once built properly, speaks for itself.